Joining us now is Aurora Cannabis CEO Miguel Martin. Miguel, thanks for being with us today. Before we get into, I think, some of the broader trends and specifically what you have afoot at Aurora, I do want to get your reaction to this. I realize it's more focused. We're talking about regulation that's specifically focused on tobacco products. But given the fact that so many people do vape cannabis as well, and I think back to 2019 when there were counterfeit cannabis cartridges that were causing all kinds of issues and fatalities and the like too. Are you watching this ruling very closely? What could it mean for cannabis?
Well, I think, it's a great question, and I really think it speaks to the value of regulatory alignment. A company like Aurora that has had such a strong relationship with not only Health Canada, but regulators across the world, it, really sets up what companies can be responsible, can have some foresight, and we're absolutely keeping an eye on it. I think while it's not as relevant to cannabis, given the small size and given sort of the way in which we and other responsible companies have gone about, clearly you want to see how society and key regulators are looking at age control products because it has an impact on all the evolutions of regulations, whether that's on nicotine products or cannabis products.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Aurora and specifically Aurora's presence in the U.S. I realize CBD is the focus currently, but I mean, just take a look at whether it's a stock chart of Aurora trading here in the U.S. or some of the other Canadian names as well. I mean, it's been a pretty volatile year. There had been expectations that you could see federal decriminalization and even potentially legalization here, and that could mean meaningful expansion of a company such as yours into the U.S. market. How are you gearing up for that, preparing for that, strategizing for that? And I guess, what would you expect the timetable to actually look like?
Yeah, I mean, so I think first and foremost, it's a big world out there, and there is progression on cannabis legislation all around the world. We're now #1 in Germany. We've had great success in Israel. We got 3 of the tenders in France. And so when you look at the entire global cannabis market, I know it's interesting to only look at the U.S., but what you have to do to be successful in those highly regulated markets is exactly the most important investments you have to make, to be successful in the U.S. I'm a strong believer that you're going to see medical first at the federal level in the U.S., and clearly a company like Aurora, which is the #1 Canadian LP in terms of global cannabis sales from a medical standpoint, will be a player. We also, things around biosynthesis and genetics and science and SNOPs, all of those will be relevant in the federal framework. I also expect the FDA to be deeply involved in the federal regulation of cannabis. And so the history with Health Canada, IMCA in Israel, and other key regulators does set us up well. Clearly, because of the stock exchange provisions, we can't participate directly in the way we'd like to, but we are supportive of the STATES Act or MORDAS Act that will allow us. But there's no doubt that companies like Aurora, and specifically Aurora, that have been successful in Canada will play a role in the U.S. at the time in which it's legal.
So Miguel, that's interesting because I feel like it was perhaps a slightly more realistic, less optimistic view than some of the other cannabis CEOs that come on in terms of the time frame you're expecting for full federal recreational legalization in the U.S. if you're focused on medical first. When do you expect to get that full recreational federal legalization?
Well, I think, like I said, first and foremost, I think you're going to see decriminalization plus a medical framework. Many of the states, including some of the key bellwether states like Florida and Virginia in the South, have gone that way. Also expect the FDA, like I mentioned, to be involved. That allows the federal government and the key regulators to be involved in this process. Typically, after about a year to maybe 2 years, you potentially then could see rec. Now, that doesn't preempt the states' rights and the opportunity, to have a very vibrant state-by-state rec business. But from a federal standpoint, I really think you're going to see medical first. And obviously, a company like Aurora that is #1 from a Canadian LP standpoint, would support a highly regulated market. And so that's my expectation. And I know it's maybe a little bit longer than most people would think. But again, I would remind people that huge international markets, Germany, France, UK, the Netherlands, Israel, are progressing very nicely. And so for the right companies like Aurora, there's a big world out there to garner economics.